All right, here we go. And so, as I said, we're in the middle of our lecture series where we're looking at political parties for and against democracy. And this topic is obviously prompted by contemporary concerns about whether or not our current alignment between the Democratic and the Republican Party um, stably supports electoral representative democracy in the United States in 2021 and going forward. And whether we talk about uh, blocking of the inquiry into the assault on the Capitol on January 6th of this year, or we talk about efforts to make it more difficult to vote in many states, the farcical recount effort in Arizona. There are signs that the Republican Party is less attached to the core norms that structure electoral democracy in the beginning of the third decade of the 21st century than is necessary for the health of democracy in America, and that this is in fact something of a global trend. It's not just the United States, but right-wing populism globally is increasingly withdrawing its fidelity to democracy and becoming much more instrumental, trying to win at any cost, even if that involves suppressing or distorting either votes or truth. And so in this climate, I think it makes sense to look at political parties as both institutions that are absolutely indispensable for modern electoral democracy, but also as institutions that have a checkered history, sometimes supporting, sometimes turning against democracy. And that in fact, in the modern era, the main path via which democracies have foundered and ultimately collapsed is when political parties have turned against them. And last week we looked at the history of conservative parties in the primarily 19th century, early 20th century, the era in which modern representative democracy was being institutionalized in much of the European world, and the critical role that conservative parties have played as being, in a sense, the pivot force, the fulcrum of modern electoral politics. Sometimes conservative parties become invested, right? And the Daniel Zablat speaks of them as having sunken costs in democracy, as well as prospects for having their interests prevail within representative electoral contests, and therefore they end up committed not only to winning, but also to the rules of the game, the democratic process, being loyal opposition when, in fact, they lose. And at other points, conservatives have not developed strong parties, have not seen their interests protected by modern electoral democracy, have gone into moral panic, have made common cause with right-wing extremists, have often found their parties taken over or undermined by those whose assistance they attempted to elicit and thought that they could control. And so today I want to take us into the United States and into the history in particular of the Republican Party. I will be looking more generally as an overview of American party competition and the various realignments that we've gone through in the 200 plus years we've been practicing party politics in the United States. But the main focus will be on the Republican Party, and I hope you will see why. I think, in a sense, the Republican Party is the first modern party we have in the United States, and its position in many ways has shaped the partisan alignment in this country since the Civil War. And so that'll be the focus today. But before I get into that, I want to provide a little bit of a historical overview. And so in order to do this, I want to talk first about the period prior to the modern era. And the period I'm going to refer to as the modern era, and this is just my nomenclature, is the period after the Civil War, right? And so prior to that period, we did not have a consistent rivalry between two stable political parties. After that period, we have the Republican and the Democratic parties as the main rivals from the mid 1860s until today. So we start in 1787 with the Constitutional Convention and with the Connecticut Compromise that generated the Senate. I would point out to you that that was a 5-4 vote with one state abstaining, right? That adds up to 10. 3 states were not even present. So it was a narrow squeaker of victory, and not certainly a consensus position that created two principles of representation in American government. On the one hand, roughly speaking, one person, one vote, although obviously it takes a long time for us to actually both enshrine and come close to realizing that principle. I'll be speaking with you again today at some point, I hope, about Carol Anderson's book, One Person, No Vote, which is a history of voter suppression. So it's not fully realized, if at all, until the 1960s. But going back to 1787, the principle articulated for the House of Representatives is a principle of popular proportional representation. Each person should have equal influence over the outcome of the vote, where what counts as a person, is it a male property owner? Is it a universal male suffrage? Is it an African American? Is it a woman? Shifts over time. But that's one principle of representation. The second principle of representation is at the state level. Each state gets 2 representatives in the Senate. And of course, the presidential election is structured via the Electoral College, which combines those 2 systems of representation to determine how much electoral punch each state will have in determining who the next president will be. And this then structures the politics of the United States, the nature of the electoral system that we have, by structuring the principles of representation that are included in our Constitution. The other factor that also stems from 1787 that it seems to me is extremely important in structuring American politics is the so-called Northwest Ordinance, which on the one hand envisions an expansion of the United States, especially westward, and on the other hand, as it's written in 1787, prohibits the expansion of slavery into new territories or states. And this is extremely important in terms of confining what Lincoln will later call slave power. It doesn't ultimately succeed, but the idea is that while we're admitting slave states, we will not continue to admit new slave states, only the original slave states. And on the other hand, that people who want economic opportunity can go west if they do not find it in their own state. And that is, in a sense, essential to the idea that the United States is an egalitarian society, a society with upward mobility, a society without fixed hierarchy or stratification. And so very important to the political ethos of American society is the Northwest Ordinance, which also was there from the from the founding, sorry. In the 1790s and through the first decades of the 19th century, you get the emergence of the first two-party divide in the United States. We spoke a little bit about this at the beginning of this lecture series, both Washington and Jefferson inveighing against the party system at the same time that they were creating it, right? And that the two parties here were the Federalists of Hamilton and Adams that emerged after George Washington stepped down after his second term, and they really had their roots in the debate over adopting the Constitution and were advocates of a relatively strong federal government. And the Democratic Republicans, the party that Thomas Jefferson founded and then handed over to James Madison. And that was a party that somewhat ironically was founded on the principle of states' rights and a weaker federal government, but actually ended up strengthening the federal government. In 1815, the Federalist Party collapses, and that's as a result of its position on the War of 1812, which it opposed just as Andrew Jackson was winning that war, right? And the Democratic Party is kind of the next iteration of the Democratic Republican Party. It's organized in the middle of the second decade of the 19th century. And then there's this idea of the era of good feelings, which is to say, this is a moment in American history, a relatively brief moment in which there is only one party. You know, that doesn't last very long, and on the other hand, it results in perhaps a less competitive, less fractious moment in American history. By the way, I'm drawing in part on Michael Tomasky, who has a very good timeline in his book, If We Can Keep It, of transformations in partisanship in American history. The 1830s, the Whig Party begins to take shape. Doesn't last very long. Founders ultimately on the issue of slavery and slave power. And as the Whig Party collapses in the middle of the 19th century, the Republican Party is organized by people like Horace Greeley, the very important mid-19th century journalist, and Abraham Lincoln, and a new generation of politicians who are firmly opposed to the Kansas-Nebraska Act that Stephen Douglas authors and sponsors in the Senate, and of course the famous antagonist of Abraham Lincoln in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act is formulated as a states' right act put into play by the Democratic Party, but essentially it allows for slavery to be decided state by state, with Stephen Douglas and almost everyone in America recognizing that what that means is that slavery will be extended into new territories and new states, because slave owners, and by the way, I was fascinated to figure this out in the reading I did. 90% of American slaves were owned by 1% of the Southern population. This was highly concentrated wealth. and sorry to refer to the ownership of persons as wealth, but that's in part what it was in the middle of the 19th century. This was a system in which most white Southerners did not, in fact, participate or benefit. And the result is that that 1% of the population was extremely wealthy, extremely powerful, right? Because they controlled, in a sense, the voting power of their slaves as well. And they had the power, as was shown in Kentucky and Kansas and elsewhere, to either by purchasing influence or using violence to extend slavery into almost every Western territory once the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. Now going back to Horace Greeley here for a moment, and the very important debate over slavery that emerges in the 1850s. It's Greeley who really reformulates the abolitionist case as being not only about the grievous injustice and barbarism of chattel slavery, an issue, that is to say, to do with the rights of African Americans, but also a critique of white oligarchy over poor whites. And Horace Greeley says, look, if we want to have a society in which we white men are equal citizens, in which white men have equal economic opportunity, in which therefore there's not fixed hierarchy and the possibility for social mobility, we cannot allow slavery to be extended to the West, because the West is the relief valve for the pressure for economic opportunity, where people can, quote, go west, young man, if you find insufficient opportunity in the East. If slave power extends west, then that will no longer be the case, and the United States will have its own aristocracy, its own oligarchy, its own hierarchy. In other words, Horace Greeley made the slave issue about white democracy, not simply about African American rights. And this was a very important change in the way in which the issue of slavery was debated beginning in the middle of the 19th century. It was no longer simply about abolitionism. It was also about oligarchy. And I'll give you a sense in a moment of the position of the South Carolinian James Henry Hammond, who was much more forthright, right? Stephen Douglas said, look, this is about states' rights, when everybody knew what it really meant was about the extension of slavery. James Henry Hammond gives a much more direct and explicit view, a defense of oligarchy in the United States. This ultimately, right, the emergence of the Republican Party, Abraham Lincoln's victory in the 1860 presidential election, leads to the Civil War. So at that point, you have the rivalry between the Republicans and the Democrats beginning to emerge, but it's a wartime civil war, not really a condition that allows for a stable party system to emerge. But by the end of the Civil War, Lincoln's assassination at the beginning of his second term, you really get a close to this first chapter in American history and the beginning of the second chapter. In thinking about the second chapter, what I'm going to call modern democracy, modern partisan alignment in the United States, I want to start by introducing, I think, a really interesting perspective on this. And this is the perspective of Frances Lee, a eminent political scientist, American political scientist. She studies American politics, that is to say, at Princeton University, and looking in particular at her most recent work, Insecure Majorities, Congress and the Perpetual Campaign. But to lay the foundations for this, I want to just briefly gesture. This book was published, I think, maybe 3 years ago during the Trump era. This book was published about a decade ago. And this book, the Beyond Ideology book, I think is important for focusing on the Senate. And there are not very many American political scientists who focused exclusively on the Senate. And what Frances Lee found in focusing on the Senate in the first decade of the 21st century is that there was something peculiar going on in terms of partisanship. She shows that in the second half of the 20th century, the Senate was a more collegial, cooperative, bipartisan institution than the House of Representatives, and that it was frequently the case that the political parties found ways in the Senate to identify legislation that was mutually acceptable or at least represented a compromise, to co-sponsor it, to vote together for it, that the Senate was the more bipartisan legislative body in the Cold War and post-Cold War era. But that begins to break down in the 1990s and fully breaks down in the first decade of this century. And what she finds is, I think, very interesting, which is that it's not the case that there isn't bipartisan support for a wide variety of legislation. You can take the issue of immigration, for instance, or you can take the issue right now being debated in our country of infrastructure support. These are bills that are supported by both parties in terms of their principles. They may not agree on the details, but they certainly agree on the overall objectives. And there seems to be lots of room for compromise or horse trading or working things out, and yet they don't. They stop doing what they had been doing for the second half of the 20th century. And her analysis shows that it's not because they can't find common ground, it's because they see it as strategically disadvantageous to be seen as collaborating with the other side. And so it's actually the nature of partisan competition, not the nature of the issues, that causes the decline of bipartisanship in American politics in the 21st century. All right, so with that background, I now want to turn to insecure majorities and to a diagram from the book that I think is extremely powerful and illuminating. This is the diagram, and I will try to make sense of it for you as quickly as I can. It goes from 1861 to 2013. And what it shows is the relative dominance of one party or another. And by relative dominance, Frances Lee means, let's take votes for the House of Representatives, votes for the Senate, and votes for the presidency, and combine them into an overall metric of how the party did in a particular election. And what you can see is that from 1860 to the middle of the 1870s, by the way, when these lines go down, that indicates Republican strength. When the lines go up, that represents Democratic strength, right? That from the 1860s through the middle of the 1870s, the Republican Party dominates American politics. In the last 15 years of the 19th century, there's more back and forth. This is the end of Reconstruction to 1896. And in this era, Grover Cleveland wins the presidency a couple times, and the Democrats begin to become the party of workers. And as the urbanization of the United States, industrialization takes place, the Republican Party begins to lose ground. So there's a period of stasis. And then again, in the late 1890s, through really the Great Depression, with the short exception of the Bull Moose Party split, right, caused by Teddy Roosevelt leaving the Republican Party, there's an era of Republican dominance, right? And if you squint, if you look at this in terms of the long duration, essentially from the 1860s through the 1920s, the Republicans were the dominant party in American politics. And similarly, and I'll be quicker here, right? You get, and I assume this is more familiar, Franklin Delano Roosevelt elected in a landslide election in 1930, and then the Democrats dominating American politics through roughly 1980. And although you have Eisenhower and Nixon, and so a little bit less dominance in a couple periods, I will argue ultimately drawing in particular, and I should have said this earlier on the work of Heather Cox Richardson, that Eisenhower is not a Reagan Republican. In many ways, he's a Lincoln Republican. And so although the Republicans do better in some of these elections, it's in part because they shift their ideology to a more egalitarian position. So again, squinting, I think you can see three eras in American politics: an era of Republican dominance from the 1860s through the end of the 1920s, an era of Democratic dominance for roughly 50 years from 1930 to 1980, and then post 1980, a protracted period of rough equity between the parties. And that it's that period that I think is extremely important in thinking about polarization in American politics today. And that this is, in a sense, exceptional. And it's important to understand that for at least long periods in the modern era of partisan competition in the United States, we have had one-party dominance, not complete exclusion of the other party, but clearly one party is more powerful. The other party at most breaks through intermittently, but often is in a relatively permanent minority. Why is that so important? Here I'm going to draw on Ezra Klein, who I'll be speaking with you more about next week. I think a really interesting contemporary American journalist. You may have seen his interview with Barack Obama in the New York Times just a few days ago. And Klein offers, I think, a clever, succinct summation of Francis Lee's work. And he says, look, when you have basic partisan parity, the priority of a politician or a party is the following. First, win election or win re-election, right? You got to get into power to do anything. Second of all, win the majority, right? And third, influence governance as much as possible, right? And so if it's always on a razor's edge, always open, who's going to control the Senate in 2022? Who's going to control the House in 2022? We don't know, right? That's an election where perhaps everything will be up for grabs. And if historical norms hold, it's entirely possible that the Republicans will regain power, right? And so this is an important incentive for them now, and not just during the election. Third, influence governance as much as possible. That is to say, actually pass policy that reflects your constituents' interests or your party's ideology. Now, if we're not in an era of partisan parity, which is to say, if we're in a sense, any era from 1860 to 1980, right? The vast majority of the modern era of American partisan competition, then the idea of winning the majority is not really in play. You're pretty sure who the majority is going to be in the next election. And that means that the priorities of the political parties and individual politicians shrink to just winning the election and influencing governance and policy as much as possible. And that means in particular that the minority has an interest in finding ways to work with the majority, right? It's the only way they're going to get anything done. And given that they're not in the foreseeable future going to win the majority, there's not much gain in obstructing the majority. They're going to be able to legislate anyway, and it's not going to influence your future electoral prospects. But when we get into conditions of partisan parity, right, where the two parties are neck and neck, then the second objective and the third objective compete with each other. If you are seen as collaborating with the party that currently has a majority, if the result is that legislation gets passed and that legislation is good for the country, perhaps in part because you influenced it, nevertheless, that might increase the likelihood, the prospects, that the current majority party will retain its majority. And so in part, Frances Lee suggests what she saw in the Senate from 2000 to 2010 is that this idea of winning the majority reemerges as a top priority, a priority that is more important than passing legislation that your party favors if your party is in the minority. And of course, the Senate being what it is, it's actually very easy for the minority party to block the majority party from governing, as we're of course seeing with the 50-50 split in the Senate right now and the constant threat of filibuster, right? And so I hope this is clear, right? In a sense, what Frances Lee is suggesting is that the period from 1980 to 2013, when viewed from the long-term bird's eye perspective of American partisan history, is either anomalous or a new period. And that much of the functionality of American government from 1860 to 1980 depended on the dominance of a single party. All right, so with that kind of bird's eye overview, let me now get a little bit more down in the weeds about the periodization, the eras of American politics, partisan politics in the post-Civil War era. And
David,
so, yeah, please, go ahead.
Before we leave that diagram of the political dominance of the political parties, I had a question. Back in Lincoln's time, the Republican Party were the progressives. And then with the Great Depression, the Democrats certainly became the progressives. So if you look at the chart that way and say, what were the politics of these people, regardless of party, it seems like the progressives have dominated. Now, somewhere along the line, the Republicans switched from being progressives to being total meatheads. So where is that point?
So that, am I right, that was Robert Hoffman, or who was that asking that question?
It was Bob Yerger.
Oh, Bob, I'm sorry. I thought I recognized your voice, but for some reason the yellow box was on Robert Hoffman. All right, so total meatheads, I think you might have invented a new political science term, let's notice, and I'll get into this a little bit more, when we look at this diagram and then map ideology onto it. One of the things that we've got to notice is the oscillation of the Republican Party. And so from 1860 to the middle of the 1870s, the Republican Party is clearly a progressive, egalitarian party, right? It's an anti-slavery party, but it's also an anti-oligarchy party. From the late 1870s and especially in the 1880s, the Republican Party becomes increasingly the party of big business. And the Democratic Party becomes a workers' party, a white workers' party. And so the transition that you're talking about has occurred already in the late 19th century. Now, it's hard to be a party of big business and to succeed electorally in an era of monopoly capitalism, right? And so part of the reason you get this rough stasis here is because the Republicans, when they become identified as the party of big business, have a hard time actually consistently winning elections. And this leads to Teddy Roosevelt becoming a second Republican progressive, right? And so the Republican Party, and here I'm drawing on the analysis of Heather Cox Richardson in this book, to Make Men Free, A History of the Republican Party, which is the main foundation for my lecture today. The Republican Party oscillates between being a party of big business and on the one hand, and on the other hand, being a more progressive party. And it does this at least 3 times, right? It starts out as a progressive party. It then becomes a party of big business in the 1880s. Then in the early 20th century, under Teddy Roosevelt's leadership, it again becomes a more egalitarian progressive party. It then goes back to being the party of big business, especially under Hoover. And then under Eisenhower, it becomes a more egalitarian, more progressive party, including in certain issues of racial justice in the middle of the 20th century. And then, of course, under Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, all the way back perhaps to Barry Goldwater, it goes back to being a more conservative party. So I'm not sure it actually quite maps onto what you're saying, Bob, but I think there is certainly a kernel of insight in what you're saying, which is if you become identified purely as the party of big business, you have a hard path to electoral success in the United States in an era of industrialization and concentration of wealth and income. So that the Republican Party is kind of whipsawed by the fact that it is reliant on big business going all the way back to the 1880s to finance its campaigns and its press. And on the other hand, that if it gets too clearly identified as a party of big business, it's going to regularly lose the popular vote. Does that help to think about that a little bit more, Bob?
Yeah, basically I was looking at it as a sign of optimism that progressives really have dominated a lot of this. And so hopefully the trend is the same way, that the progressives will, in the end, beat the meatheads.
Yeah, and I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, I guess.
Oh, I think it probably, I'm sure.
And the issue has to do, in part, with the structural dependence of political parties on financiers, right? And for much of the last decade of the 19th century, and especially for the middle of the 20th century, the Democratic Party has an alternative source of financing in labor and labor unions, right? And part of what has happened in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the decline of labor, and hence the need of the Democratic Party to identify an alternative source of finance, and the increasing influence of affluent Americans on the Democratic Party. But the Republican Party has been fairly consistently financed by big business. And that takes different forms, whether that's robber barons or industrialists or post-industrial capitalists. And that has both been advantageous and disadvantageous, right? I think it's both. The money helps, but if you become clearly the party that is opposed to equality of opportunity, redistribution, empowering the average citizen, that's a powerful critique to put in the hands of the Democratic Party. All right, so let me continue, and that's a good point, and thank you, Bob. It got us, in a sense, into some of the issues I wanted to conclude on today. But let's go back to our history now for a little while. And I'm going to now take you through very quickly the era of Republican dominance from 1861 to 1929. And this is what Michael Tomasky calls the age of power. It's the age in which, on the one hand, the United States is emerging as a genuinely powerful country, and on the other hand, in which highly concentrated wealth created by new industries is transforming American society and power within our society. And so we go from Reconstruction to the Compromise of 1877 that ends Reconstruction and the Hayes-Tilden deadlock. I know I'm moving fast. I want to have a little time at the end for doing some more interesting stuff. Interrupt me if you really want me to review this history in greater detail. Then in the 1880s to 1890s, we get an era that is one of intra-party competition, right? That is to say, the competition, in a sense, is as much within the parties as it is between the parties. And so in particular, with the Republican Party, we get a split between two different ways of thinking about the Republican Party being a big business party. On the one hand, a more formal civil service orientation, or alternatively, a more spoils-oriented political party. That's the split between the so-called half-breeds and the so-called stalwarts. And the Republican Party, in part, torpedoes itself a couple of times in this era. And the Democrats split also into a pro-immigrant and workers, Northern and Western party, and a party of Jim Crow racial hierarchy in the South, right? And so that's already occurring in the 1880s, 1890s. And just to point out, you do get two Democratic presidencies in this era. Grover Cleveland, the only president to serve two non-consecutive terms, right, is president in the second half of the 1880s, and then again in the middle of the 1890s. And then beginning in the beginning of the 19th century, you get the rebirth of liberal republicanism under Teddy Roosevelt. You get the split with the Bull Moose Run in 1912, and as a result, Woodrow Wilson becoming a Democratic president, relatively rare in this era of Republican dominance. And then you begin to get some important anti-immigrant legislation. There's some earlier than this, but the Johnson-Reid immigration bill of 1924, in part, is designed to suppress competition for domestic workers from immigrants, but also in part designed to limit immigration so as to limit the influx of new Democratic voters. You get the Great Depression in 1929, and with it, the beginning of the era of Democratic dominance, which is the middle of the 20th century, and an era that Tomasky refers to as an age of consensus, in the sense that the Depression, World War II, Civil War, all give us, in a sense, an external enemy that allows the two parties to moderate their differences and to find common ground and work together a fair bit. And so although the Democratic Party is dominant, the Republican Party is collaborative in the middle of the 20th century. And so you have Franklin Delano Roosevelt's long presidency from the 1930s through the 1940s, of course, cut short really only by his death. You have the battle over the New Deal and eventually the reworking of the federal judiciary and constitutional law to allow the New Deal to progress. You have Dwight Eisenhower's presidency, and as I've indicated, he is a third progressive Republican on Heather Cox Richardson's analysis. And so although you have a Republican presidency in the middle of the era of Democratic dominance, Tomasky and Cox Richardson and others treat Eisenhower really as continuing the New Deal policies. You have the Vietnam War. You have President Johnson signing the civil and voting rights bills in 1964 and 1965, and then the beginning of the post-civil rights partisan realignment. And so worthwhile emphasizing that the era of Democratic dominance, which continues another 15 years after Johnson signs those bills, depended on the solid South, right? The Dixiecrats, the Democratic Party being the dominant party in the South. That allowed the New Deal legislation to be passed and then repassed, and the federal judiciary to be gradually reconstituted to end its hostility to the New Deal. And so the Democrats had made their peace with a wing of the party that in many respects was a different party, right? VOK refers to the Southern Democrats as conducting a foreign policy through the Democratic Party with the rest of the country. The FDR notoriously did not put measures into the New Deal that protected the economic rights of African Americans in order to allay the fears of Southern Democrats or to secure their cooperation. And sometimes he passed New Deal legislation or early civil rights legislation in part by building a coalition of Northern Democrats and Republicans and leaving the Southern Democrats out. But he couldn't do that very often. That is what Johnson does to pass these two landmark pieces of legislation, but that starts an era of partisan realignment in which the South becomes increasingly Republican and the Democratic Party loses its almost impregnable electoral advantage, right? And so we have also in 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act, which again opens the door for new citizens to join the country. And we're still dealing with the effects of that with a much more diverse populace and electorate as a result. And then we have the Roe v. Wade decision, which in 1973, I don't think anybody had anticipated, but emerges as perhaps the first and kind of defining culture war issue of our new, more polarized politics beginning in the 1980s. Then we have Nixon resigning from the Watergate crisis in 1974. Then we get into the present era. All right, so with that historical overview, and I know I've got just a few minutes, I at least want to start introducing you to Heather Cox Richardson. And let me just ask, how many of you are familiar with her already? Is that a name that you've heard? And I see Robert, I see several of you, Wilma, raising your hands. And are you familiar with her books, or are you familiar with her because of her podcasts or her letter or her media appearances?
Her letter.
Letter from an American, right? Yeah, Wilma, you too, is that right? Okay. I'll just point out to you, by some metrics, Heather Cox Richardson is the most successful independent journalist in America today. She publishes this letter from an American, and on a subscription service, tens of millions of people hear from her every day, right? And so it's not surprising that some among us had heard of her in this way. But she's also a prolific scholar of American history whose main focus is the Reconstruction era in American politics, but also the Civil War era. She's a professor, by the way, at Boston College. She lives in Maine. She must have a heck of a commute on the family estate that's been in her family for, I think, 100 years. And she has been doing very interesting work all the way back to her dissertation on the domestic agenda of the Republican Party during the Civil War and the Reconstruction era. And she says, look, we tend, obviously, and for good reasons, to focus on the way in which Lincoln conducted the Civil War. The battles, the war, the victory of the North, ultimately, then the occupation and reconstruction of the South. But in so doing, we miss out just how revolutionary, how transformative the domestic policy agenda was that the Republican Party pursued in the first half of the 1860s, and how, in a sense, these two things go together. The reason Lincoln was fighting to retain the Union was to build a new, more inclusive, more egalitarian America. And in order to do that, he had to transform the nature of the economy as such. And he set about doing that side by side with conducting the war. All right, so that's just a little bit about Heather Cox Richardson, and the book, like I say, that I'm focusing on is To Make Men Free, but I'm also beginning to look at the book that was just published this year, How the South Won the Civil War, and the issue about the way in which the Republican Party and the ideology of the West as a land of opportunity went from being Lincoln's party and an anti-oligarchic understanding of the West to being a party of big business, in which the West became the cowboy West, in which the West became the excuse for not pursuing more egalitarian politics, because if you wanted opportunity and you didn't have it in the eastern or midwestern cities, it was just because you were too lazy or cowardly to go west, where there was still plenty of opportunity. On her account, that is, by the time we get to the 1890s, inaccurate, historically inaccurate. But nevertheless, it's a very ideologically useful card for the Republican Party to play in opposing unionization, redistribution, etc. I just looked at the time, and I do see that I am out of time, and I do want there to be some time for questions. So we will pick up next week looking at the very interesting argument that Richardson is making about the Republican Party in the 1860s and then its transformations in the 1880s and 1890s. For now, let me stop and just see if you guys have questions, thoughts, comments. Who wants to start us out? I'm going to unmute everybody, so beware your background noise might pick up.
I want to say something.
Flossie, go ahead. Yep.
It's interesting that MSNBC has concentrated on showing us what happened to the Southern Wall Street in 1901, the destruction of a very prosperous Black community. It fits right in rather nicely.
Yeah, so this is right one of the more atrocious post-Civil War episodes of racial violence in which a white mob descended on a affluent African-American community in Tulsa in 1921. Joe Biden was just there marking the 100th anniversary of it, the first time a president has really publicly taken much notice of this episode in American history. And for those of us who might be opposed to redistributive measures, reparations, to create more level competition between African Americans and whites in 2021. Part of the reason to call attention to Tulsa is to say, look, the reason that African Americans lack wealth in the 21st century has a long history. That history doesn't just end with slavery. There is systematic violence used to either prevent African Americans from accumulating wealth or to destroy that wealth once it's been accumulated, right?
Yes.
And so as horrific as the death of probably 300 plus people is, the more systemic importance of remembering Tulsa is to recognize that state power has been used to build a white middle class and has often been used to prevent the formation of or even destroy a Black middle class. Yeah, Flossie, and in a sense, you're pushing us ahead a little bit into the race question. But it's important, especially since we talked about, or since we just commemorated the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre, to talk about that a little bit today. Anybody else want to come in on issues from today's lecture? I hope it didn't feel too much like revisiting high school history. It does have significance for understanding the nature of partisan competition in the United States today. No other questions? John, you can talk if you want to. Who is that?
It's Suzanne.
Oh, hi, Suzanne.
Hi. I don't know what's going on with my computer, but anyhow, in terms of Tulsa, there was a superb PBS documentary on that earlier this week, I think Tuesday. So anybody, I think people can still see it if they go to pbs.org and type in Tulsa Massacre.
And I'll just, were you done, Suzanne?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just point out to you two more sources The New York Times online has a very detailed reconstruction of Black Wall Street that shows you kind of business by business, the individuals, and then shows you which businesses were destroyed, in what order, how protracted and systematic the violence was, the way in which churches and hospitals, which were providing refuge, were attacked as well. And then there's an episode of the HBO series called The Watchmen, and it's the first episode of that series that starts with a reenactment of the Tulsa massacre. And so there are multiple sources out there if you're desiring, if you want to come up to speed on this. Anyone else?
Yes, it's Doris.
Hi, Doris.
Hi.
You haven't said anything for a while. Nice to hear from you again.
Thank you. Well, I just wonder about the role of the labor unions in this whole series, as well as the military.
So I'm not sure quite where to go with the question about the military. Let me start by noting the labor unions, and of course, Flossie called our attention last week also to churches, right? And so, of course, there are civil society institutions that are very important here. I mentioned briefly that in the era of democratic dominance from the 1930s to the 1980s, part of the challenge for the Democratic Party as a workers' party going all the way back to the 1870s is to identify sufficient financial support. And please note that that's recruiting and training politicians, financing their campaigns, but it's also financing newspapers and other forms of publicity, right? We could think all the way up to Rupert Murdoch and the Fox News network today, right? If you're going to compete in the kind of free-for-all system of electioneering that we have in the United States, in which there's very little public financing. By the way, most every other democratic society subsidizes not only candidates, but parties, right? The parties themselves, in order to free them from reliance on private wealth. The Republican Party, beginning in the 1870s and clearly in the 1880s, identifies the emerging industrial capitalists who they helped to create through the war effort and the munitions industry and the railroads going all the way back to the 1860s. They are integral to funding the Republican Party all the way to the present. How will the Democratic Party be funded? One answer to that is through unions, but that then depends on unions being large and being healthy. There's an obvious imbalance of wealth even when they are large and healthy. But when they begin to decline, and I think there's been an over 50% reduction in unionization of the workforce over the last 40 years, when that occurs, then there's a real difficulty for the Republican Party. I'm sorry, for the Democratic Party, for the party that generally caters to workers' interests. Where are they going to get their funding from? And if it's not coming from unions, what are they going to do to secure funding from wealthy liberal individuals? Maybe be less clearly a working class party. And the result is perhaps that workers are going to be attracted to some of the Republican ideas if the Republicans are smart in playing on other issues, patriotism, race,
Yes.
etc. Thank you, Doris. Good point. Did that help to think that through a little bit?
Yep, thank you.
All right, everybody. Good being with you as always. And take care. Have good weeks. I will see you next Saturday. Till then, bye-bye. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, David.